"This spot isn't for you," my son said, his voice low, like he was embarrassed to say it aloud. We were standing by Derek's grave, the lilies I had brought still wrapped in their crinkled paper, the stems damp against my wrist. There was no warning, no preamble, just those 5 words that cracked the world open beneath my feet. I didn't speak right away. I looked down at the grass, then at the space beside the headstone, the one we had chosen together 34 years ago when we still thought forever meant something solid, something dependable. Derek's name was carved clean into the granite, with the dates chiseled in soft serif. Below it, just beneath the shared surname, was mine. Not the dates, just the name. A promise carved in stone. My place. But not according to my son. Not anymore. I am 81 years old. I live alone in a quiet apartment above an old florist shop, the kind that still smells like earth and eucalyptus. I walk with a cane now, but I don't complain. My knees ache, but not as much as my heart has these past few years. I come to the cemetery once a month, always on the 3rd Wednesday, and I always bring lilies, Derek's favorite. He used to joke that they smelled like old perfume and quiet apologies. That day, I came not just to visit him, but to ask Father O'Connell if I could confirm the paperwork for the second plot. I didn't expect it to be a question. I didn't expect to be told gently, with that polite clerical concern, that my son had requested a reallocation of the adjoining site. They said there had been a change of plans, Father O'Connell explained, flipping through the files with his fingers. He wore that slightly uncomfortable expression men wear when they're caught between politeness and truth. "But your name is still here, Mrs. Harlow. It was never legally amended." That was when Daniel stepped forward. "There's no need to make this complicated," he said, without looking at me. "We've made new arrangements. This spot isn't for her anymore. Not Mom. Not Mother. Her. Like I was some distant relative who had wandered into the wrong pew at a family funeral. The priest looked at him, then at me. "The original deed is in her name," he said, careful, slow. "Nothing has been officially changed." Daniel didn't argue. He just shifted his weight and said, "We'll sort it out later." I stood there, my coat still buttoned, my purse in my hand like I was on my way somewhere else. The lilies drooped slightly in the breeze. I don't remember much of what was said after that. I think the priest excused himself. Daniel said something about getting lunch. I didn't go with him. I stayed. I sat on the little stone bench near the hedge and stared at the name I used to sign on permission slips and birthday cards and tax documents. Harlow. It used to feel like home. Now it felt borrowed, like something I'd have to return. I suppose I should explain what came before that moment. I should tell you how a woman ends up standing at her husband's grave while her only son politely suggests she no longer belongs next to him. But there's no single answer. That's the thing no one tells you about being erased. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, like rust on a hinge, like fog on a mirror. One day you wake up and realize your voice has been dialed down to a whisper in rooms where you used to be the center. And you think, maybe it's just aging. Maybe it's just the way things go. You don't realize it's personal until someone speaks about your own body, your own name, your own grave, as if you were already gone. Daniel wasn't always like this. He used to be the boy who cried when I left for night shifts. He'd wait by the window with a blanket around his shoulders, holding a flashlight like a sword. He called me his lighthouse. That's what he said when he was 6. "You're my lighthouse, Mom. I always know where home is because of you." Somewhere between then and now, I became the draft in the hallway, the creaky stair, the voice from the other room that people learned to tune out. And still, I loved him. I forgave him. I understood stress and mortgages and wives who don't want your mother too close to the family calendar. After Derek died, I held on to the few things that made me feel tethered to something real. The lilies, the cemetery visits, the side of the bed I no longer touched. I didn't ask for much, just a spot. A square of earth beside the man I spent 49 years with. I didn't even tell Daniel I was coming that day. I thought maybe, if I handled it quietly, there'd be less resistance. I didn't expect him to show up at all. I certainly didn't expect him to speak for me. What no one tells you is that the betrayal doesn't feel sharp. It's not a knife. It's a dimming, a narrowing of air. It feels like sitting in a room that used to echo with your laughter and realizing the walls have been repainted in colors you don't recognize. It feels like watching your name be spoken in the past tense, even while your heart still beats. When Daniel walked away that day, he didn't hug me. He didn't ask if I needed a ride home. He just said, "We'll talk later," the way people do when they want to end something without admitting they've already ended it. I stayed at the cemetery until the wind picked up and the leaves began to move like whispers. Then I picked up the lilies and rewrapped them, tighter this time, like maybe if I held them right, they wouldn't fall apart on the way home. I didn't tell anyone about the priest's expression or Daniel's words. Not right away. I went home and made tea. I sat in the armchair by the window, the one Derek bought me when I turned 70. It has a worn patch on the left arm where my elbow always lands. I held the teacup in both hands and stared at the wall across from me, where the sun hits just right at 4:30. That little square of light has always comforted me. But that day, it didn't come. Clouds, maybe? Or maybe just the weight of that sentence still ringing in my ears. This spot isn't for you. It was supposed to be. It always was. We chose it together. On a Sunday, after church. Derek had joked about how morbid it was to plan our graves while we were still healthy. But I liked the idea of being close, of knowing where I'd go. There's something soothing about certainty. And then Daniel decided it wasn't mine anymore. Just like that. Like a reservation canceled without notice. Like a name crossed off a list. You spend your whole life making yourself small so others can feel big. You soften your voice. You move aside. You wait for your turn. And then you realize the line you thought you were standing in was never moving toward you. You realize you were never even on the list. That's what that moment did. It didn't just take my spot in the ground. It took the idea that I had a place at all. And yet, in that same moment, something else started. Not rage, not grief, something quieter, something like clarity. I looked at Derek's name. I touched the edge of the stone, and I said, not out loud but in my mind, they don't get to decide where I rest. They don't get to decide who I am. Not anymore. It happened the next morning, though in truth it had been happening for years in pieces so small I didn't see them stack. I was making oatmeal, the old-fashioned kind, the kind that takes real time. I had always believed in slow things. My kettle hissed. The spoon moved in circles. I wasn't crying, not yet. My body was steady, but my breath felt borrowed. That's when the phone rang. I let it ring twice. I didn't want to pick it up. I knew it would be Daniel. And it was. His voice was brisk, like he had somewhere more important to be. "Hey, Mom, about yesterday. I think you misunderstood." Not an apology. Not even a pause. Just the reshaping of events to suit the script he preferred. "We're just trying to be proactive," he continued, as if rearranging my burial was the same as organizing the garage. "Carla's been researching long-term options, and it just doesn't make sense to keep things the way they are. The plots are expensive. That space could go to someone who really needs it. Someone who really needs it." I stood at the stove, spoon in my hand, listening to my own son explain why my place beside my husband had become inefficient. I didn't answer right away. He filled the silence with words like logistics and estate planning. I stared at the bubbles rising in the pot, how they surfaced and broke without a sound. Finally, I said, "That space is already mine, Daniel. It was paid for, years ago. You were in high school." He exhaled, that sigh he uses when I'm being difficult, when I dare to say anything that doesn't align with his vision of how mothers should behave. "It's not about money, Mom. It's about practicality. Carla found a place in Rockville with a family memorial stone. There's a whole row open. We could have something cohesive, something elegant, cohesive. Elegant. As if love came in matching granite." I didn't argue. I just hung up. There was nothing else to say to a man who thought graves were about aesthetics. I turned the burner off and poured the oatmeal into a bowl, but I didn't eat it. The idea of food felt obscene. I sat down at the table, hands flat, and stared at the steam curling upward, disappearing before it reached the ceiling. That was the moment it became clear. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a clerical error. Daniel didn't want me next to Derek. He didn't want me anywhere that could be traced too closely to his story, and he didn't want to say it plainly, because that would require looking me in the eye and calling me what I had become to him, a complication. Later that week, I received an envelope in the mail. No note, just documents. Prepaid funeral packages, brochures for cremation services, a checklist labeled end-of-life preferences, with boxes already ticked off in someone else's handwriting. Scrawled at the top in Carla's pen, "We thought this might make things easier." Easier for whom? I turned the pages over, one by one. The kind of paper that feels like a contract before you've agreed. There was even a printout from a cemetery in Rockville, complete with a glossy photo of a tree-lined path and a caption that read, "Where legacy lives in tranquility." I wanted to laugh, but the sound caught in my throat. Legacy. As if my life, my marriage, my years of folding sheets and paying bills and surviving surgeries and showing up to everything without being asked could be replaced with a landscaped brochure and a modest cremation discount. I went to my file cabinet and pulled out the original documents for the plot beside Derek's. I'd kept them in a blue folder marked Final Plans. The receipt was still crisp. Paid in full. My name printed clearly. I ran my finger over the ink. Proof that I had once been visible, that I had mattered in a way that left a record. I took the folder and placed it on the table, beside the untouched oatmeal, and sat there for a long time. I thought about the day we picked that spot. Derek and I. It was spring. The trees had just started to flower, and the cemetery was unusually bright. He had insisted on a west-facing plot because he wanted to watch the sunset, even in death. I had laughed, and he had squeezed my hand and said, "Promise me we'll stay together, even here." I had promised, and I had kept it. Until Daniel decided that promises only counted if they matched the color scheme. That afternoon, I tried to call Daniel, not to argue. I just wanted to hear his voice and ask him, gently, plainly, what he was afraid of. But he didn't answer. The call went to voicemail, and I didn't leave a message. I didn't know how to summarize that kind of grief in 30 seconds. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time afterward, hands folded in my lap, like I was waiting to be told what came next. The next morning, Carla came by unannounced. She knocked twice, sharp and bright, like someone who believed they were doing a good deed. I let her in. She brought a reusable grocery bag filled with soup, vitamins, and a new electric blanket. "We just want you to be comfortable," she said, smiling with her teeth. She didn't ask to sit, just moved around the apartment adjusting things. She fluffed a pillow, rearranged the tea towels, commented on the light bulb in the hallway. "We could have someone come by, help out a bit." Daniel's been researching some support options. You're still doing okay on your own, right? I nodded. Of course I nodded. That's what women like me do. We nod. We accept the illusion of care even when it's a mask for control. She opened the pantry and frowned at the arrangement. You're still using canned beans? She asked, like I had confessed to shoplifting. We can sign you up for a grocery delivery service. You shouldn't be carrying things anymore. I wanted to ask her who gave her the right to decide what I carried. Instead, I said, "Thank you, but I managed just fine." She hesitated then, just long enough for her real face to show. Not the polite daughter-in-law expression, but the one that calculates. She sat down finally, across from me, crossed her legs and said, "Daniel's just trying to be thoughtful. He worries about you. The cemetery thing, it wasn't meant to hurt you. We just think it's more streamlined if we keep everything in one place." Streamlined. She said it like I was a spreadsheet that had gotten too long. I looked at her, really looked, noticed the perfect nails, the expensive watch, the way she avoided the photo of Derek on the shelf. "I already have a place," I said quietly, "next to my husband." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes the past needs to be adjusted to fit the present," she said. That was the moment I realized they weren't just planning my death. They were curating it. They were crafting a version of me that could be folded neatly into their narrative, quiet, cooperative, and conveniently absent when needed. They didn't want to remember the woman who held Derek's hand through chemo, who worked nights to pay for Daniel's college, who mended socks until her fingers cracked. They wanted a placeholder, a silhouette. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the refrigerator hum, the occasional groan of the pipes. I thought about the brochures, the checklist, the quiet replacement of my name. I realized I wasn't grieving just the plot. I was grieving the erasure of my story, the slow replacement of reality with politeness, the way I had become an optional footnote in a family I helped build. I rose at 2 a.m., turned on the lamp, and pulled out the folder again. I spread everything on the kitchen table, receipts, certificates, handwritten notes from Derek about the cemetery visit. I lit a candle, not for ritual, but for clarity. And I sat there, in my nightgown and wool socks, looking at the truth. I was not mistaken. I was not confused. I had been deliberately removed. But I was not gone. After that night, something shifted. Not in them, but in me. There are moments in a woman's life when silence stops being safe and starts being a signal. I stopped answering calls. I didn't slam any doors. I didn't send any letters. I simply let the quiet stretch longer. When Daniel texted, "Let's talk soon," I didn't reply. When Carla sent an email with subject line, "Future considerations," I marked it unread. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was aware. And awareness is a strange kind of heat, like the slow burn beneath boiling water. Not dramatic, but irreversible. I began noticing things I used to forgive. The way Daniel called, only when he had something to solve. The way Carla's voice tightened when I mentioned Derek, as if grief had an expiration date and I'd let mine spoil. The way no one asked me how I was sleeping, whether I had enough groceries, what books I was reading. I was a problem to manage, not a woman to know. And slowly, I began to manage myself instead, on my own terms. It began with small acts. I went through the drawer where I kept old insurance policies and bank documents. Not to update them, not yet, but to see whose names were where. I made a list, just pencil on paper, of everything that still bore my full name. I circled the things that didn't. I found a credit card I hadn't used in years, one that wasn't linked to Daniel's accounts. I tested it with a small online order, 3 books and a pair of wool slippers. It worked. That felt like something sacred. I opened the freezer and realized half the food in there had been brought by Carla. Meals to make things easier, all labeled with dates and microwave instructions. I threw half of it away. The rest I set aside in a bag and dropped at the church pantry the next morning. I bought ingredients for soup, the kind Derek used to like with lentils and cumin, and filled my apartment with the smell of my own memory. When the phone rang the next time, it wasn't Daniel. It was the parish secretary. "Mrs. Harlow," she said, "Father O'Connell wanted to confirm whether you're still listed on the double plot. There was another inquiry this morning from your son." I closed my eyes. Of course there was. "I still hold the deed," I said. "I'm not relinquishing it." She paused, respectful but cautious. "Would you like us to add a note to the file? To flag any changes as invalid unless signed directly by you?" "Yes," I said. "Please." I could feel the tremble in my hand even as my voice stayed steady. She thanked me and hung up. I stood in the middle of my apartment afterward and realized I was sweating. Not from fear, but from the work of holding still while something inside me cracked open and reformed. A week later, a woman from Daniel's office called. Not his secretary, someone higher up, his firm's estate liaison. She introduced herself with a voice like polished glass and said, "We're just reviewing some elder care documents for Mr. Harlow's mother, and we'd love your input to ensure everything aligns with your wishes." It was phrased like a question but delivered like a script. I asked her what documents she meant. She mentioned power of attorney, living will, medical proxies. "We've been advised by the family that you may want help streamlining your paperwork," she said. That word again. Streamlining. I thanked her politely, said I'd need time to review everything, and hung up. Then I went to the bathroom and threw up. Not because I was sick, but because the realization hit in full. My son was quietly redrafting the boundaries of my personhood, one form at a time. I called a lawyer, not one from Daniel's world, not a firm with embossed business cards and mahogany desks. A woman named Nadine. She was recommended by the woman who runs the secondhand bookstore near the bus stop. Nadine's office was in a strip mall next to a dry cleaner, and her waiting room smelled like old carpet and lemon cleaner. But her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp. I told her everything, not dramatically, not as a plea, just as fact. She listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she said, "You're not the first mother they've tried to domesticate into silence." She helped me draft a new power of attorney, one that excluded Daniel entirely. We updated my will. We added a clause about burial wishes, specifically naming the plot beside Derek and attaching the original deed. She made copies and gave me a folder thicker than any I'd held in years. "Keep it somewhere obvious," she said. "People pretend to misplace things when they don't like the contents." After that meeting, I didn't go straight home. I took the bus across town, got off near the old library Derek and I used to visit on Sundays. It had changed. Fewer books, more computers, but the building still smelled like dust and thought. I walked slowly, letting my cane click against the tile. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I saw it. A poetry book we once read together, spine cracked, corners soft. I checked it out with my own card, the one I hadn't used in years, and sat on a bench outside, flipping pages. I didn't cry. I felt aligned, like something in the world had finally tilted back into a shape I could recognize. The next few days passed without calls. I think Daniel sensed the shift. Or maybe he was just busy. I didn't care. I started walking in the mornings again, even if only a block or two. I went to the bakery and bought the same loaf of bread every Thursday. I chatted with the girl behind the counter, who wore too much eyeliner and always asked about my day. I opened my windows more. I dusted the piano. I let music play during dinner. Nothing dramatic, nothing revolutionary. but every small act was a stitch in the fabric I'd been told I no longer needed. One afternoon, Carla showed up again. No warning. She brought me a new phone. With better visibility, she said, placing it on the table like a gift. I looked at it. Did I ask for a new phone? I asked calmly. She hesitated. We just thought it might be easier to stay connected. The old one doesn't have location sharing. I smiled. Not cruelly, not even coldly, just with the kind of smile that says, I see you. My whereabouts aren't a problem, I said. My boundaries are. She blinked, clearly not used to that tone from me. We're just trying to help, she said again, the mantra of people who can't hear their own footsteps over the line. I nodded. Help is something you offer, not enforce. She didn't stay long after that, and she didn't take the phone with her. That night, I made tea and watched the streetlight flicker against the sidewalk. I thought about Derek, about the way he used to say, the world gets quieter when you stop asking it to understand you. I understood it now. I wasn't looking for understanding anymore. I was looking for alignment, for proof that I still existed outside the version my son preferred. I opened Nadine's folder and ran my fingers over the signatures. I felt like a woman who had signed herself back into her own story. I didn't tell Daniel about the lawyer. I didn't need to. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't defiance. It was clarity, sealed and notarized. I went to the cemetery again the following week, alone. The lilies were fresh. The wind was low. I stood by Derek's grave and placed my hand against the stone, then opened my coat pocket and slipped the new deed copy into the tiny brass capsule they allow for memorial keepsakes. It fit perfectly. Not as a secret, as a signature, as a vow. I wasn't done yet. But I was beginning. It was around that time I stopped marking the calendar. The little red pen I used to circle doctor's appointments, family visits, and delivery days remained tucked in the drawer, untouched. There was something liberating in not tracking time for anyone else. I no longer had visitors to prepare for or reminders to send. The silence in my home began to feel less like absence and more like ownership. I woke when I pleased. I went to bed without ceremony. I wore what was warm, not what looked agreeable. The air in the apartment changed. Not literally, but emotionally. It no longer waited for them. It waited for me. One Thursday afternoon, I pulled out the sewing box I hadn't opened in years. It still smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. Inside were neatly wound spools of thread, buttons in small plastic bags, a tape measure curled like a sleeping cat. I mended the frayed edge of my winter scarf and then, without quite meaning to, began stitching a small square of fabric with my initials. M.H. It felt absurdly meaningful. Not because it was beautiful, it wasn't, but because it was something I hadn't done in so long. Something without purpose, without audience. A mark of presence. I kept that little square folded in my coat pocket. Not as a symbol, not even as protection. Just a reminder. Of me. Of now. I began speaking to Derek again. Out loud. In the apartment. Not in a dramatic way. Just murmurs. Little remarks as I boiled water or folded towels. He had always been the quiet one in our marriage, but he had listened. I imagined he still did. You'd hate the phone they gave me, I told him once. It tracks location. I think it sends alerts if I wander too far from their idea of dignity. Another time, standing in front of the mirror, I said, "Remember how you used to say I looked my best when I was mad?" Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. Anger, when clear, becomes a kind of light. It reveals. And I had never seen so clearly. It was around this same time that I went back to the church, not for Mass, but to the small archives room behind the nave. The door was always open during the day. The woman who managed it, Sister Helena, was often at the desk sorting envelopes or typing slowly with 2 fingers. She looked up when I entered, pushed her glasses up her nose, and smiled without surprise. "Looking for records?" she asked. "Something like that," I said. I told her about the plot, briefly without names. She nodded. "You're not the first," she said. "Families try to tidy up the dead before the living are even done with themselves." She pulled out a dusty binder, flipped to a tab labeled "Reserved," and ran her finger down a page. "Still here," she said, undisturbed. "Your name's written in pen, not pencil." That means something. I asked her for a copy of the record, and she made it without question. As the printer hummed, she said, "People think legacy is about monuments, but it's really about memory. Who gets remembered and how." I nodded, folded the paper, and tucked it into the same folder Nadine had helped me build. My little war chest of identity. Before I left, Sister Helena added, "The strongest women I've met are the ones who stopped asking for permission." I didn't answer. I just held her gaze and felt something rise in my chest. Not pride exactly, but its quieter cousin. Clarity. The clarity didn't arrive like thunder. It came the way fog lifts, quietly, with patience. I began to look at everything in my home as if seeing it for the first time. The dent in the sugar jar, the hairline crack in the bedroom window, the photo of Daniel at age 7, still crooked in its frame. I didn't take it down. I just stopped expecting it to speak for a person he no longer was. I cooked smaller meals. I lit candles in the evening, not for guests, but for atmosphere. I stopped watching the news. I began rereading old books, not for plot, but for the sentences I had underlined in my 30s and forgotten. In the margins, I had written things like, "Yes," and "Me too," and "Someday." I traced those words with my thumb and whispered, "Today." One morning, I took the long way to the bakery and walked past the old community center. On impulse, I went inside. The receptionist looked up with a pleasant confusion, the way people do when the elderly arrive without agenda. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I used to take sewing classes here," I said. She smiled. "Still do. Monday mornings. You're welcome to drop in." I did. The room smelled like fabric and effort. The other women were mostly younger, mostly tired-looking, but kind. I stitched a new square with my name. Not initials this time. The whole thing. Martha, in pale blue thread. One of the women leaned over and said, "That's a beautiful name." "I hope someone still calls you that." I nodded. "I do," I said. "I call myself that." That night, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and watched the neighbor's cat move between bushes like a shadow with a schedule. I thought about how long it had been since anyone asked me about joy. Not contentment. Not health, but joy, I asked myself, aloud. "Martha, what brings you joy?" The answer came not in a rush, but in layers. The way the floor creaked beneath me, the taste of bitter tea, the way the city lights looked when blurred through a wet window, the sound of Derek's laugh in memory, warm and imperfect, my name stitched in thread, a folder filled with documents that said, "I exist, I chose, I signed." I didn't tell Daniel about the sewing classes. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't a secret. It was mine. And maybe that's what changed most during those weeks. Not the facts of my life, but the ownership of them. I no longer waited for calls. I no longer hoped to be understood. I no longer softened my voice out of habit. I wore the scarf I mended. I walked without location tracking. I held my own name in my mouth and found it still fit. It started with a letter in the mailbox, cream-colored and slightly bent at the corner. No return address, only my name in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. I stood with it in my hand for several minutes before going inside. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the counter, made a cup of tea, sat at the table, and stared at it as if it might say something first. When I finally peeled back the flap, the air around me changed. 6 pages, densely written in Daniel's handwriting. Controlled, slightly slanted, unmistakable. It wasn't a letter. It was a case. An argument dressed up as concern. He wrote that I had caused unnecessary distress to the family, that Carla was beside herself, that the children were confused, that no one could reach me and everyone feared something had happened. He said they were willing to talk if I was ready to be reasonable. Reasonable. As if decades of unpaid childcare, silent support, and being gently moved to the margins of every room were somehow unreasonable. There was no mention of the cemetery, no mention of the phone with location tracking, no apology, just performance. The entire letter was a rewrite, a clean version of events where they were the ones left in the dark. I folded the pages neatly, placed them back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer, where I kept instruction manuals for appliances I no longer owned. The next day, I received a call from a man who introduced himself as Derek Sorensen. I almost laughed at the coincidence. My Derek had been kind, and this one clearly wasn't. He said he was a legal representative acting on behalf of concerned family members. He asked if I was safe. He asked if I was being influenced. He used words like competency and protective interest. I told him I was quite safe and hung up. My hands shook for a while after that, not with fear but with fury. There's a particular flavor of rage reserved for being doubted when you're finally clear. I went straight to Nadine's office with the letter and told her everything. She helped me write a formal cease and desist, clean and unambiguous, with phrases like harassment under the guise of guardianship and retained local legal counsel. We mailed it that afternoon. She offered to send a copy by certified post. I said no. Let them wonder if I'd escalate further. Let them feel the discomfort of not knowing. I returned home to find a voice message from Daniel. He didn't yell. He never does. That's the thing about his cruelty. It's always polite. He said he was disappointed, that he didn't understand what I was trying to prove. He ended with, "If this is how you want to be remembered, that's your choice." I listened to it twice, then deleted it. I didn't need to archive emotional blackmail. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, listening to the branches scrape gently against the glass. I thought about legacy, not the version in brochures or gravestones, but the one built in invisible labor. Every lunch packed, every wound kissed, every silence swallowed to keep peace. I thought about how quickly all of it could be rewritten by people who felt threatened by memory. 3 days later, Carla appeared at the bakery where I now spent my mornings. She stood by the pastry display, out of place in her tailored coat and patent leather shoes, pretending to study the muffins. I didn't move. I continued wiping the counter, letting her feel the temperature of unfamiliar space. Eventually, she stepped forward and said my name, too quietly, like she knew it didn't belong there. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded toward the corner booth. We sat. She didn't order anything. She reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "Daniel doesn't know I'm here." I looked at her. She looked tired, which surprised me. She was always immaculate, polished, efficient. Now she was frayed at the edges, like a garment washed too many times. "I'm not proud of how things happened," she said, "but I also didn't expect you to disappear." I raised an eyebrow. Disappearance implies I was looked for. She swallowed. "Kieran's been asking about you," she said. That stopped me. Kieran, my grandson, the only one who used to come over just to sit on the floor and ask about the war, the garden, the time I got lost in Madrid and found my way back by smell. I had wondered about him. He's different, she added, and I could tell she meant it. He found a letter in your drawer. The one you wrote but didn't send. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, not shame, just the ache of being known when you thought you were invisible. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Kieran, as a toddler, sitting on my lap in the garden, both of us laughing, cheeks round with joy. Behind it, a note. I remember. I always remembered. That was all. I placed it on the table and looked at her. You don't need to play messenger, I said. He knows how to reach me. She nodded. He might. She stood. I didn't come to argue. I just wanted to say, and here her voice faltered, which I didn't expect. I didn't want to erase you. I just didn't want to live in your shadow. And there it was. The real thing. The truth unwrapped. I looked at her, not cruelly, not triumphantly, just clearly. I'm not your shadow, I said. I'm someone you never really saw. She left without finishing her sentence. The following week, Kieran called. He didn't start with apologies. He said, "Hi, Grandma." His voice had deepened since I last heard it, but the rhythm was the same. We talked. Not for long, but enough. He told me he missed me, that he started working at a bookstore, that he kept a birdhouse I'd helped him build in his closet for years after it fell apart. I told him I was safe. I didn't tell him where I was. I didn't promise to visit. I just said, "You mattered. You still do." And that was enough. After the call, I sat in my chair and looked at the photo. Not with tears, with steadiness. Then another envelope, this one thicker, from a regional news outlet. Inside was a clipping. Community section. Missing matriarch. Family seeks help locating beloved grandmother. A photo of me from years ago, holding a pie. Quotes from Daniel, from Lisa. Words like vulnerable, beloved, missed. I laughed aloud, once, sharply. Not the type, they said. She's not the type to vanish. As if abandonment must be loud to be real. As if disappearing wasn't the quietest rebellion of all. I kept the article, not out of sentiment, as evidence. That night, I wrote a letter to Kieran, a real one, on thick paper. I told him he could visit, if he came alone. I told him I wasn't angry. I was just done waiting. I didn't know if he'd come. I didn't ask for confirmation. I mailed it the next morning. A week later, he showed up. Taller. Older, but still him. We didn't hug right away. We sat in a motel room and talked about books, about music, about freedom. When he left, he gave me a book of poems. Inside, he had underlined one line. There are women who rise not from fire, but from forgetting who told them they couldn't. That night I slept with the window open. The wind was cold, but I was warm, in my coat, in my clarity, in the silence that finally belonged to me. It wasn't rage that pushed me. It wasn't even grief. It was a stillness so complete, it felt like standing in the center of a hurricane, the world spinning and shouting around me while I sat in the eye of it, untouched. Something inside me had long stopped begging for approval. What I needed now wasn't their permission. It was their acknowledgement. Not as a mother or a matriarch or a sentimental footnote in someone else's obituary plan, but as a woman whose name had been carved in stone by her own choice, not theirs. I waited until the first frost passed. The earth would be firm, but not frozen. I wore my thick coat, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and took the folder, my folder, the one Nadine had helped me build, and left the apartment before sunrise. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't need to. The cemetery was empty when I arrived. The air was sharp with that metallic taste that only comes in early winter, and the sky was pale, washed in the color of porcelain. I carried with me a thermos of tea, a small chair, and the envelope from the church archives. Everything was methodical. No panic. No drama. I set the chair beside Derek's grave, placed the folder on my lap, and began. I unfolded the updated will, the notarized burial directive, the original deed, and the certified copy from Sister Helena. I spread them out across the grass like offerings, sacred and undeniable. Then I opened the thermos and poured a cup of tea, letting the steam warm my hands. I sat like that for nearly an hour, waiting. At exactly 9 o'clock, Father O'Connell arrived. He was surprised to see me. He said so, but he smiled. "You've come prepared," he said. "I've learned the only language people don't argue with is paper," I replied. He chuckled, then grew serious. "They've called." "More than once." "Asked about revisions." "Said they had your consent?" I nodded. "They didn't." He knelt beside the documents, adjusting his glasses, and read each one. Slowly, thoroughly. "Everything here is valid," he said at last. "Legally, morally, spiritually, this plot is yours." He paused, looking over the headstone. "He would have wanted you here." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Truth rarely needs repetition. He offered to place a permanent note on the church's records. I agreed. Then I asked if I could leave a sealed envelope in their vault, a copy of everything, with instructions to be released only upon my death. He agreed to that too. "Families change stories," he said gently, "but paper doesn't forget." Before he left, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to fight anymore, Martha." I looked at him then, really looked. "I'm not fighting," I said. "I'm finalizing." Later that afternoon, I walked to the notary's office, an old storefront with faded signs and plastic plants in the windows. The woman behind the desk remembered me. She greeted me by name. That meant something. I handed her a single-page statement I had written by hand the night before, titled, "On the Subject of Final Belonging." It wasn't poetic. It was clear. I, Martha Harlow, of sound mind and independent choice, declare that the burial plot beside my husband is mine by right of legal purchase and marital intention, and that any future attempts to alter this arrangement without my direct and written consent are to be considered fraudulent, coercive, and without standing. It ended with a sentence that took me the longest to write. I do not consent to being replaced, rewritten, or relocated. She stamped it, dated it, added it to the growing packet. I walked home in silence, but my steps felt louder than they had in months. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell Carla. They would find out eventually, and I no longer needed to be there when they did. But I did write a letter, not to them, but to Kieran. I told him what I had done. I enclosed a copy of everything. I told him that legacy isn't made of gravestones but of decisions, of the way we insist on being seen even when the world dims the light around us. I told him he didn't need to protect me, but he did need to remember me accurately. He called 2 days later. He said, "You're the bravest person I know." I told him, "I'm not brave. I'm tired of pretending I don't exist." He laughed, then paused. "That's the same thing, isn't it?" After that, I didn't wait for more envelopes. I didn't listen for the phone. I didn't return to the church for weeks. I didn't have to. The thing about a climax is that it doesn't always feel like thunder. Sometimes it feels like quiet, like air returning to a sealed room, like a locked door clicking open and no one noticing because the sound is so small. I spent those weeks living the way I had always wanted, without performance. I read the books I wanted to read. I wrote letters with no intention of sending them. I rearranged my apartment, moved the photo of Derek to the shelf nearest my chair, so I could see him without turning my head. I stitched new initials into the scarf. Not just mine. MH, and underneath, DH, together. Even if no one else understood. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself without searching for anything to fix. The woman looking back at me wasn't soft, but she wasn't brittle either. She had lines, but they weren't apologies. They were archives. I said my name out loud. Once, twice. Martha Harlow. And I smiled, because it still sounded like home. Some days now, I forget to be afraid. I wake up and make tea and open the window and forget for a little while that anything ever tried to disappear me. The air smells sharper lately, and the light through the blinds looks like it did when I first moved in, before they started calling with their plans, their pre-written endings. I keep the folder in the drawer nearest the door, not because I expect another visit, but because I like knowing it's there, real and physical, and mine. I no longer watch the phone. I no longer wait for mail. I've learned that absence can be its own kind of blessing. When no one comes to correct your life, you get to live it uninterrupted. On Thursdays, I still walk to the bakery. They know my name now. Not as Daniel Harlow's mother, but as Martha. Just Martha. The girl behind the counter started saving the last rye loaf for me, even if I come late. She says, "I figured you'd want it," and I always say thank you like it's the first time anyone thought ahead on my behalf in years. I sit by the window and read the paper slowly, without urgency, without pressure to report back to anyone. Sometimes I bring my sewing, a quiet square of cloth in my lap, a needle between my fingers, the thread pulling through like breath. I still visit Derek, though not as often. Not out of neglect, but out of calm. I know he's there. I know the space beside him still holds my name, both in ink and in stone. I no longer feel the need to prove it. That plot is no longer a battleground. It's a promise, sealed not by argument but by clarity. The plaque now bears both our names. A quiet brass line that reads, "Reserved, Martha Harlow." No dates, just presents. The cemetery staff added flowers last week. Not for a service, just because. They told me a young man, Kieran, sent them. I didn't ask for them, but they made me smile. Dignity, I've found, isn't loud. It grows slowly, like moss on stone, soft but stubborn. Kieran calls sometimes, not often, but when he does, he asks real questions, not the kind you ask out of duty. He asked me once what I was most proud of, and I said, the things I kept when no one wanted me to keep them. He didn't ask what those things were. He just said, "Me too." That was enough. We don't talk about Daniel. We don't need to. Some rifts don't close. Some truths are not for healing, but for honoring. I don't hold anger toward my son. Not anymore. Anger takes too much tending. I let it go, like smoke out an open window. What remains is something quieter. Distance, yes, but also relief. The freedom of not needing to be understood by someone determined not to see. Last week, I took a photo of myself. Nothing posed, nothing polished. Just me in the mirror, holding my tea, wearing the mended scarf with the initials stitched close to my neck. I printed it and wrote my name on the back. I put it in a drawer beside the folder. It's not for anyone else. It's just a record. Not of beauty, not of legacy, of survival, of decision. A visual sentence. She stayed visible. I think that matters. If another woman reads this someday, one who's been told she's imagining things, who's been given pamphlets instead of presents, who's been offered help that feels more like quiet removal, I hope she remembers this. They will try to make you disappear. With kindness, with planning, with gentle words that sound like safety. But you are not required to vanish politely. You are not required to agree to your own fading. You can stay. You can say no. You can sign your name and sign it again, and keep signing it until it sticks. I'm 81. I live alone. I have a place. I have peace, and my name is still mine.